Well, we're very honored this afternoon to have with us as a visiting scholar in residence in the Communication Leadership Studies program here at Gonzaga University, Dr. Gerry Philipsen from the University of Washington. Gerry has been at the University of Washington for more than 30 years. I guess I could say he's actually responsible for developing more than 30 PhD students who are out there around the world, really, in many places, teaching, doing scholarship in the field of communication, particularly around the ethnography of communication, speech codes, speech code theory, and so on. So we're very pleased to have with us Dr. Gerry Philipsen. Hi, Gerry. Thank you for coming. And
hi, John. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we've had a good few days. And this part of what we're doing is for our students, not only local, but our distant students who can't be here and can't attend, but they can hear some of the ideas that you've espoused and developed over your long and distinguished career. We have a couple that we'd like to just sort of start with. Could you just share with us how you first became interested in the study of communication? And then attached to that, who for you were your mentors or the people that you sort of built yourself to say, they've got something to help me and teach me, and I grew from that process?
Probably I got interested in the field of communication when I went to college and university, Denver, in 1963. The first thing I did was join the debate team, the speech and debate program, competitive forensics activities. I did oratory and was very passionate about that. I'd done that in high school as well. And I did debate, and I was very committed to that, and I did that in high school as well. But I was a college debater for 4 years, and at one time had some hopes of winning the national championship. At least my partner did. But I discovered that I wasn't good enough to win the national championship, and I consider that nonetheless that was a good learning, to learn your limits. But I did have 4 very enjoyable and intense years of doing that. While I was an undergraduate at the University of Denver, I took a course in group discussion. And that was in my freshman year. It was actually the first course in communication that I took at the college level. And that opened my eyes to a different way of speaking from debate, a different way of working together to settle differences and to accomplish things. And I continued to study that subject throughout my 4 years at the university and took all the courses that I could take in it, and eventually decided to come into the field of communication, or to make the effort to do that, as a teacher and scholar of group communication and discussion. And so I think that's what I would say how I got my start. I could go back earlier in my autobiography and talk about high school and pre-high school opportunities and experiences in speaking and preparing speeches and delivering them and that sort of thing. But I think I would date it from my undergraduate years. Okay.
And you went on to graduate school at Northwestern University. Mm-hmm. And were there particular either faculty at Northwestern or in your reading and your becoming a scholar that you really started to really value what they were writing about and how they were approaching the field that really set you on fire to some extent?
Yes, and I should say something I didn't say in answer to your previous question, that Al Goldberg was my teacher of discussion at the University of Denver, and he really did introduce me to that way of communicating, sort of cooperative deliberation in group interaction. And I also was influenced greatly by Roy Wood, who was on the faculty at Denver at that time, later was at Northwestern University. He was my debate coach, and he also taught group processes as well as other things, argumentation and so forth. And they were both very influential on me. Al Goldberg told me that the place to go to study group communication at that time would be Northwestern under Franklin Heyman, who was a very well-known and successful and eminent scholar and teacher and author on that subject. He was the co-author of the book Dynamics of Discussion, and that captured my attention and captured my interest. I went to Northwestern to study with Frank Heyman and got there and found him to be quite an agreeable person, but also found that, and took some courses with him, but also found that he was really devoting his efforts to other things. He was emerging as a very serious scholar of freedom of speech, and he had stopped really being a full-time faculty member in terms of group discussion. So eventually I dropped that plan and did something else, and that's really another story. But I got along well with Frank Heyman and learned from him, but ended up not doing what I had gone to Northwestern to do.
Mm-hmm. One thing I mentioned this last night in the reception we held for you, that I'm both a contemporary and an admirer of yours, because we've run on parallel tracks, and one of those things I'd like you to talk a little bit about is that growth and change in the field of speech or speech communication or communication that you were part of, and really this idea of how anthropology started to influence your own work, but really the field of communication through that sort of entrance into ethnography or field work.
Yeah. Well, I think the way you put it is interesting in the sense that what was going on in the field at that time. I entered graduate school in 1967. I finished in 1972. I entered a program in the School of Speech at Northwestern University in a Department of Public Address and Group Communication. By the time I ended my program, that was titled the Department of Communication Studies, or that was the name. And during those years, the field of speech really was revolutionized or evolutionized, as you know, in the sense that many people who were studying communication more than the traditional way of studying speech were taking hold and establishing specialties in doctoral programs. And it was a great conference in 1968, I believe, at the New Orleans conference, where a couple of dozen leaders in the field organized to try to establish within the field of speech communication itself as a legitimate and thriving area of interest. And I think they did. They ended up using the label for this activity and this subject, speech communication. And that was a compromise, as I understand it, between the people who had loyalties to the traditional speech discipline and those who wanted to move forward to a discipline that was would move away from that, and a discipline of communication. And so this label was an evidence of a compromise. That's a label that I think really never took hold in the hearts of very many people. But it became the name of many departments and the name of the National Association. And eventually that really has gone into oblivion as far as I can see. There are very few departments named speech communication anymore, and the National Association is now National Communication Association. But what was going on meant that there was kind of an opening. And at that time, many people were trained as doctoral students and became young faculty members and scholars who began in this milieu of trying to establish a discipline of communication studies in the United States. And many people initiated interesting new moves in the study of communication, and there was a kind of it was an open field in a way, and some of these were studies of quantitative analysis of interactional processes in dyads and groups. Some of these were more quantitative studies of the effects of certain types of communication variables on audiences or individuals. But there was a flowering of theoretical moves and empirical moves. All of these really at one point quantitatively oriented. That was sort of the assumption. I, for various reasons, that's probably might be another question, got interested in a more descriptive, interpretive approach grounded in field work with an emphasis on examining particular cultural ways of communicating. And so I was probably not the only person interested in that, but maybe the only person who was interested in that who didn't just identify completely with intercultural communication, but rather was studying the communicative life of particular cultures and communities and using that as a starting point, taking cultures on their own terms through field work and ethnographic study. And in large part, it was my experiences in some work that I was doing when I was out of graduate school for a little while, between my first year and my last years. And I had some experiences in the world where I felt what I was finding is that how people communicate, what their codes are for what counts as appropriate communication, varied from place to place. And if you didn't grasp that, you might fail in those places, as I did at that time, and then have to learn something or walk away. And that from there, the next step would be to say, what does that tell us about communication, the subject of this emerging discipline? And what it said to me is that communication is something that is radically cultural, that the codes by which people produce, evaluate, judge, interpret communicative conduct varied from time to time, from place to place. And that this was not just an interesting side point, but this was perhaps the main point to know about communication.
You know, something you said reminded me a few years ago. Dr. Stan Dietz from University of Colorado was our visiting scholar, and we were doing an interview sort of like this one, and we also talked about our own department, Communication and Leadership Studies, being a pretty interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary approach. And Stan, in his critical theory of organizations, mentioned that part of this period of time and change in the field of communication, from his perception, actually was a negative impact, particularly around, he was talking about the psychologizing of communication. And that he was trying to look for a unified theory of communication, and looking at communication as a message-centered event and not the psychology of that. So in your case, it was, I'm not saying this is what happened, but you could clarify this. It was the anthropologizing of communication as well. And is it still focused on the message, or would you say, no, your theory, the theories that you evolved with, that they're still general theories that really look at this message-centered activity and not what's going on in the sender receiver in a given moment, or those sort of notions of psychology?
Well, I think I would say that I'm similar to him in my views, and I knew him from the time when we were both pretty young, even younger than we are today, and you know, almost from the beginning of our postgraduate experience. I think he was a few years behind me. He reacted very strongly to this psychologizing, sort of this, what he and I both felt was an over-reliance on quantitative methods that in many instances, maybe in his case, in most instances, were applied in ways that were unfortunate to being able to understand and use the communication process in its complexity and all of its fullness. He took a more philosophical approach, I think, and ultimately a critical approach, and that led him to certain insights that were quite similar to what I found by looking at it, by looking at it and listening to it, by studying it in situ in particular communities and the interactions and events that you could observe there. Now, in terms of the message focus, I would say that from the standpoint that I approach communicative conduct, in that the messages that people produce, I would tend to talk a little bit more about the communicative acts they create and perform. That does take a really central position, and I think in this ethnographic study of communication, where you're trying to find the local ways of communicating, the local means of communicating. What do people communicate with? What are the modes? Verbal, nonverbal, digital, etc. What are the things that they deploy that are available to them? And where do you find that? Well, you start from my perspective with the particular communicative act that you situate in maybe a sequence of activity in a particular event or as part of a larger community. And then what does that mean to the people who produce it and the people who experience it? How does that function? How is that received? What does it do in the community of which it's a part? And so my approach has been to say, let's try to have a way of going into any human situation, figure out what are the means of communication that are being deployed, what do those mean to the people who are using them, what are some of the effects that we can observe in situ, and that we start with an act, an utterance, something that is observable and inspectable, and maybe not just one, but you're always at any given time, you're looking at one, and then try to build up from there an understanding of what's going on in that particular community.
And so how has this work been influenced by like Del Hymes or Basil Bernstein or any of those social linguists or ethnomethodologists, Harvey Sachs, those people? How did that influence your own work?
Well, particularly, I mean, I'm interested in Harvey Sachs's work and the whole ethnomethodological conversation analytic approach, but what really influenced me was Del Hymes. I was also very influenced by Basil Bernstein, but probably more so by Hymes. And what Hymes did was, Hymes was an anthropologist and a linguist, and he looked at the contemporary state of linguistics in the early 1960s, and he said, the direction that the academic study of linguistics is going is to look at this sort of idealized speaker, not any particular speaker that we might find in some particular cultural milieu or some particular human activity, but just this idealized speaker and what's in this person's mind about language. And they developed very formalized ways of studying it and very elaborate theoretical conceptions. Del Hymes was a linguist at the same time, like Chomsky, operating in elite universities, Harvard, MIT, Penn, Berkeley, and so forth, and it was Harvard, Berkeley, Penn in the case of Hymes. And these were people who really had an enormous impact, or could, on the disciplines of linguistics and anthropology. And what Hymes said is, let's take the study of language in its broadest, richest sense, particular languages, languages that people use in daily life and in public life, and then let's take the study of culture that anthropologists are interested in. And one thing we notice is the linguists aren't really looking at the community in which these things are being done. Now that's an overgeneralization, but in general true. The anthropologists aren't looking at the details of language use. Let's look at that intersection, and that's what he meant by the ethnography of speaking, the ethnography of communication. And he said, it's that, it's that intersection of speech and all of the other modes and modalities of communication and community or culture or social unit. And let's put those together and start studying communication from that standpoint. And that's when I saw that. I had had an experience working in Bridgeport, the neighborhood I later labeled as Teamsterville, where I had these experience that led me to believe that this thing I was studying, communication, is inherently and inextricably cultural. And here was Himes was saying that very kind of thing and providing a program for its study and a framework and a perspective on it. Basil Bernstein was important too, because he was a sociologist who was doing some very interesting work in England, saying, well, if you look at people of different social classes, they use language in different ways and for different purposes, and this is very systematic. Now, the point was not to make a comment on class so much, but class just happened to be a way that people could be grouped in England at that time, where you could find those differences, not biological differences, but just differences that grew out of custom and experience and some of the structural experiences that are the structural circumstances that people might be in. If you're rich versus poor, if you have large house versus a small house, and so forth, you might just be communicating differently because of those circumstances. And so Bernstein had what he called the speech codes. And I took the term from him, I adapted it slightly, but I made it a more anthropological, a more Himesian notion, but certainly have an intellectual debt to him, a primary intellectual debt to Himes. Although, if you buy into Himes, you also have a debt to Aristotle, to Kenneth Burke,
a lot of debtors.
Yeah, to Roman Jakobson, and all of this comes together in Himes, I think, in quite a brilliant way, and that was part of the attraction too, where I said, well, okay, it's language and meaning and culture and interaction and speech and other modes of communication, and then the things people were doing in their daily lives. And here is a way to get at that. And over here, all of those things get, or some of them at least, get done differently. And if you want to understand those people, and ultimately if you want to understand yourself, you need to kind of take a look or a listen here and a look or a listen where you are, and juxtapose those and say, oh, wow, huge insight, epiphany.
Can I follow up on your, oh, wow,
yeah.
So my question is, now as a student, here you were putting all of this together and saying, look at my experience and look at this person I've just discovered in a way, I'm very excited. Now you've gone on to develop a general theory. So how did, you sat down and just started writing? How did you go from your work to a general theory?
Well, that took quite a while, actually.
You had to want it.
Yeah.
Sometimes our students see a M. Griffin book and there's 10 pages in a chapter and they think that's it.
Yeah.
So, no, that's the thumbnail.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I had courses in communication theory. I probably had 3 or 4 of them as an undergraduate and a graduate student. And every once in a while I would say, oh, I would like to do some theorizing. And then I'd start to try to do it. And it's like when I now say I'd like to write a novel. Then I can't do it.
I'm still sitting here.
I don't have it. And but I got what I got really inspired to do was to take Bernstein's notion that you have this group over here, using the same language in the same society, but using it in different ways. But then to add Himes onto it and say, instead of saying ahead, you think this is the way they're going to be and this is the way they're going to be because of some external attribute of them, class, for example, or, and today we say, Western, the West versus the East, that's going to determine how you communicate. Himes said, let's go in and just find out how they do communicate. What is going on in these places, rather than pre-formulating it or predicting it. And so I looked at how Bernstein was able to find, though, these differences across these social class groups in England at the time. And then but I would read other things and say, oh, but here's another place, here's another way of looking at it, and this person is finding these differences. And then I had the experience of going down into sort of a lower working class neighborhood, and a lot of the things that Bernstein was saying were true in that American neighborhood. And then I would live up in Evanston, Illinois, which is very kind of a high-toned upper middle class to upper class city, where I was living among the poorer people in the city, but exposed to all of that, and also a lot of what you get exposed to just on TV, actually. And there are these differences right here. I mean, I could travel a few miles and I'd be in a different speech community. So in graduate school, I wanted just to do a comparison of two, do ethnography of one and the ethnography of the other, and put them up against each other and see those differences. And my advisor, in her wisdom, said, well, if you're going to do that, you're going to have to get another advisor. And I didn't want to do that.
Dang.
So, dang, yeah.
I'm not your person.
No, exactly.
Oh, yes, you are.
Yeah.
I got a new plan.
Yeah, so she says, you drill down and you do the one you've got, which turned out to be the Teamsterville study. And so I did that. But then soon after I got out of graduate school, I started doing what I call the NACA, American spelled backwards, which would be a broader kind of cultural, American cultural take on communication. That would have different symbols and meanings and premises and rules than the Teamstervillers. The Teamstervillers are certainly American, but in some ways they're kind of a little bit more Southern European or Irish or something, or working class Irish in their codes, but nonetheless still American. But a contrast to a broader American cultural code. And so for several years I worked on the Teamsterville Code. Then for several years I worked on what I call the NACA Code, American spelled backwards, sort of broad general American. And then I was able to put those together and compare them and contrast them as two different codes of communicative conduct, two different ways to think and talk about the nature of human communication, what it's for, what the people who are engaging in it are, what how these things, the process, activity of communication can be used to influence people, and that it was just kind of down the line. It was different and systematically different in these two codes and these two sets of practices. Then I started, and then after doing that for quite a while and having one after another dissertation come into me of people studying other societies and using other languages, Japan, China, Germany, 4 different varieties of Spanish in 4 different countries, Israel, so forth. Pretty soon I said to myself, well, I've got this body of data.
Yeah.
I've got all these people doing all these studies using this common methodology, and it seemed to me it was almost a responsibility for me as an academic to say, not what we have learned about Japan or China or these Spanish-speaking countries, etc., but what have we learned about communication, which is my subject. And so then at that point, I was able to sit back, or ready at least, maybe not able, I was ready to sit back and say, okay, here's this report, here's this report, here's this report, here's this one. And then do a week sort of induction and say, okay, here's the generalization that I make. So then I lay that out in a theory that was published in 1997, a precursor in 1992, but in 1997, and said in effect, somebody out there, please prove me wrong.
Oh, an invitation.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted, people to do it. One good thing about putting that in the form of a theory is that then M. Griffin, who had this best-selling communication theory treatise, thought, well, maybe I ought to add that and put a chapter in on that. And so then it starts getting read and noticed by a lot of people. But the other thing is, my graduate students, as they came along in the mid-90s and beyond, started taking me up on that. And they'd come back with data and they'd say, you know, there's something that I think should be changed in this theory, or there's something that should be added to it. And in 2003 2003, I believe it was, 2005, I think, I had invited two of them to collaborate with me on a paper that in part revises the theory. And so we have this joint publication, Philipsen, Lisa Kuchu, Patricia Covarrubias, and we took their dissertation findings and the theory that they began with, which was the speech codes theory, and we were able to do some alterations, as well as I used the article as that chapter that was published in 2005 as an occasion to respond to some critics. And so John Stewart was one of those. I
think I saw that.
It was a friendly criticism.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, it was done in the spirit. I mean, he was asked to do it by me, actually, as editor of a volume he was publishing in. And I mean, I recruited him. My speech codes theory, the big statement of it in 1997, was put in a volume that I was co-editing with Terry Albrecht. And John was our colleague down the hall. Well, he was literally next to me, office next to mine, and I said, John, we need somebody, we've got these 5 theories appearing in this book, and we need somebody to do a sort of a response and critique chapter at the end, and would you take on all of these? And that was the sort of thing that John was a perfect person to do. And so he did, and he did what I asked, and he made some criticisms. And so I might be impolite, but I used the occasion of the later article to respond. And no, I'm sure, I mean, he and I were good friends and great colleagues, and there was always an interplay back and forth between us. And we thrived on wherever we had a difference, you know, and we exploited that in our teaching. And you know, he'd come into my class, or I'd come into his, or even wouldn't have to be there, and I'd say, well, look, this is what Stewart says, but here's what I say.
Yeah.
And you know, and then say, you know, and we know what you should follow. But he had his followers, and I had my followers, and that was just fine. And he taught mine, and I taught his, and it was a great example of this sort of productive dialogue where, you know, there was some clash, but good feeling about it. And you know, he had the same attitude. He was just trying to make his thinking better and make other people's thinking better, and I was doing the same thing. And
you know, we also had the good fortune of John being one of our visiting scholars as well. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about when I was reading the M. Griffin part, because when I was a graduate student learning ethnography, I kept being told, don't ask that, only ask what questions, describe what do they do, what do they know, what's your informant tell you, can they explain that and identify what you read this, you wrote this down, what they said to each other, what does it mean? Mm-hmm. The informant should be able to, but don't ask the how questions, don't ask the why questions. That's not what you're supposed to do. So M, in describing your work, said you were asking those what questions, but you weren't satisfied with pure description. Mm-hmm. There was at some point where you decided you wanted to go past pure description in that work. And what was that next step for you after you described?
Well, that was speech codes theory, and my feeling was, here I had this body of information available, some of which I had produced of different cultures and their ways of communicating, much of which my students had produced the same thing across many countries, many languages, and so forth. And then there was even much more than all of that in other people, other places doing that. And so, again, it seemed to me that my job as a professor of communication, a student of communication, was not to say, I'm the person with the big statement on American culture, or Teamsterville culture, or Japanese culture, but rather the kind of statement that I should be expected to make was about communication. What is communication? How does it work? What makes it effective? And so when I felt excuse me, when I felt I was able to do that, able in the sense of I had the information from which to theorize. Mm-hmm. I mean, I wouldn't do sort of a Dietz or a Stewart move, you know, read the philosophy, write a theory. You know, I mean, I would be oppositional to them in that regard,
Right.
and pretty strongly so. I went from the other direction and say, you know, I've got all this information, which of course was not, you know, it was tainted by theoretical notions and assumptions that I might have. Of course, I'm not naive about that. But what can I build up from the ground and say, it appears that there are some things that work the same way everywhere. And so that's what I was after, to do that. And for some time I had the information, but I didn't feel I was able to think it through. And then at some point I had the information and I said, you're going to think it through as best you can. And then say, okay, here's the best I can do. And that 1997 chapter, A Theory of Speech Codes, that was the best I could do. And if somebody said, well, it isn't very good, I'd say, well, that's fine. You know, that's irrelevant to me. That's the best I could do. And if you think there was something wrong with it or something that need improving, tell me.
Yeah.
And you know, if I've got time left, I'll try to improve it.
In M's book, he puts your theory in the context of intercultural communication.
Okay.
And yet, so much of intercultural communication is about race, ethnicity, gender, and so on. So how do you think your work kind of fits with that other work, or is it really quite a separate study, culture and communication?
Yeah, I look at it as somewhat different from intercultural communication as it has most often been treated in the field, in the sense that I am trying to look at, I try to present an approach to the study and understanding of communication, either academic understanding or everyday understanding of communication, that is informed by a cultural perspective and a cultural lens or a cultural hearing of it. And then, if that's been done well, I think what that provides is a very strong basis for saying, now here's how we should think about what intercultural communication is, and here's how to do it. And for a long time in the field, there were people outside the field who were taking this kind of approach to the study of intercultural communication, but a lot of people in the field were approaching intercultural communication from the standpoint that would say, what we start from is our knowledge of communication, as we think we have it and as we have formulated it circa 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000, whatever. And I was approaching it, well, and then they say, and so then we talk about intercultural communication. And so their books and so forth would look very much like a book on communication. And then, but we plug in the cultural aspects. I wanted to say, let's look at communication in particular cultures, and then say, now here is what we have to say about communication and intercultural communication. And I do think that, I mean, I would argue that in most of my work, well, let's say in some of my work, there's an explicitly intercultural focus, where you have NACA and Teamsterville people communicating, or others, and that's the main thing that I've done. But my students have many other cultural encounter points that they look at, and I think that the method that we've been using and the perspective, to me, is the right thing to start from for the theory or the practice of intercultural communication, and to me, it's the only place to start from for it. But so I would say that this is what should be the foundation of intercultural communication.
I have my students in my undergraduate comm theory class critique those theories in M. Griffin, small groups, small teams, presenters on that work. And one of the things that I have is there's this big question that they have to address, which is the so what question. After this theory is all said and done, so what? What is the big thing this provides, or insight, or pragmatic kind of thing? And I think I know how you're going to answer this, but I could be wrong.
Well, I'm not sure, but go ahead.
I could be wrong.
I'm working on it.
But I think it's probably what you're going to be talking about tonight with cracking the codes, and maybe in the new work of your center. So, so where does this theory or theorizing of yours, summarizing 30 or more years of getting to this spot, what's the so what on this? What do you think is the insight or key or Rosetta Stone about your work and us living together in society?
Yeah. Well, I think there are a couple of things. And one thing I would say to start off with is that this whole enterprise of mine came about because of a failure of communication. A point at which I got off the bus to go to the office, the building in which I work, and between the bus stop and the place, I came to the conclusion that I had been given an enormous responsibility to take a service program in a neighborhood and take it from a situation where it was failing. And for a couple of months I had been leading that effort to save it. Not only was I making it better, I was making it worse. And in part what I was learning, or felt that I was learning, and I think a lot of people did validate that for me as time went on, it was because of the way I was communicating. And my methods had worked before in similar circumstances, but they weren't working there. And so as I walked from the bus, I had this insight. You failed. All right.
That one was clear.
All right. Okay. That's one. Now you either must, you fail. You must do one of two things then: admit failure and leave, or admit failure and learn something. Now, I think what I have learned at that point, I got some very crude learnings using certain ways of doing it that helped me eventually succeed in that situation. Succeed enough that all of the indicators of failure had been reduced and basically eliminated, and I was asked to stay on in that job. So I consider that a success. And so then I say, well, what does one have to know, or what can one know in order to be able to function in a situation where you might have to deal with difference, whether it's racial, ethnic, economic, class, geographic, motivational difference, or whatever. And so I think after 40-some years of thinking about this and studying and in teaching it, I think I have some answers to that, and I will present some of those in the lecture tonight. I mean, it won't be sort of, here are 3 things you can do that work quickly and necessarily work every time. It depends on how artfully you do it, and it also, in many, I think, as with all communication situations, it depends on the other people involved, and there are a lot of factors and variables and contingencies. But I really do think that this is a method that people, once they learn, can work with. Now, I do have evidence of a sort. I mean, I've had many people over the years come up to me and say, I read your study of Teamsterville. My spouse came from there, or someplace like that. Yeah. Now I understand my spouse. All right? And one of the things they understand about their spouse is that their spouse has a different code of communication than they do. Now, I married a woman 42 and a half years ago. We grew up in very similar cultural circumstances. Our parents knew each other when they were young people. And we were raised somewhat the same language, English language. And there was a point at which, you know, having not been married very long, I learned that she had a different sort of gendered expectation for me. She wanted me to be more decisive and more powerful in my role. I wanted to be more dialogic as to how I would be a husband. And so right there, you know, I mean, there, you know, can one diagnose such differences? Doesn't mean one can overcome them, but you can keep trying.
Yeah, right.
Become very decisive.
Become very decisive. Yeah, and now only 40 years later, it's all resolved. And I found out what the real issue is. How often does he take out the garbage? but so I mean, I really do, and I think that one can diagnose conflicts. One can also, if this is of interest to a person, and it might not be, and in every code, it's not necessarily a desirable thing, maybe you find out about who you are and get a better sense as to what you are and what you want. And I think that happened with me. Certainly the Teamsterville experience changed me. I was a different parent. I wasn't a parent then, but when I became a parent, I was a different one because of that experience. And instead of, and I'm not a fan of Teamsterville by any means, but it pushed me a little bit to be a little bit different and not quite the crazy Nacarema I was when I went there. I've been at the University of Washington for 34 years. I mean, there are times when the administration announces something and I can see the code in it. And I can get faculty members to look at that and we say, well, maybe we need to oppose that code. So I just think that life is filled with ways that one can apply this, just as one can apply a good rhetorical theory. Our team went down to Africa and we went into a fairly remote region, and we were able to learn things about how people could work together, that people who were raised there and now had British and European PhDs in social science working in the capital city of their country didn't quite grasp until we had gone, and I mean, I didn't do this work, I just observed it being done. And so I just think that it's an extremely applied thing. I like to work with it really at a very theoretical level and so forth, and that's kind of fun and interesting to me, but it's always in my mind, you know, okay, there you are, walking from the bus to the building. You've failed. You know, you've decided that leaving is not an option, and in some profound ways it was not. So you say, therefore, I must learn something. How? I think that's an enormously practical question.
Maybe we could ask you a question, Gerry, about Gonzaga and our program. You know, our master's degree is called Communication and Leadership Studies. We're not sure how it's perceived people outside, because that's not a traditional place that communication departments join those two themes together. But from your perceptions, not since you've been here, but maybe before, or how do you see these concepts linked to one another?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that strikes me about those is that those are two very appealing words to people. You know? I mean, you know, and I don't mean that in a way to say mere marketing.
No.
I mean, they're important for a reason. Communication, I think that we have come to realize over the past 50 years or so, is the key to many things. I mean, I would resist people who would say it's the only key, or it's the, you know, it's the substitute for everything. I mean, I think there are many other things that might eclipse it. You know, maybe honesty, maybe hard work, maybe a pure heart, whatever. But but I think it's hard to deny the importance of communication to human beings in terms of the living of their lives, their work lives, their home lives, their lives as a participant in a larger world of meaning. Leadership is also an important thing. People in organizations cry out for good leadership. This is useful to people, to have good leaders. Many people have a desire to be a capable leader. And to me, this is a worthy and a noble desire to do that. And so each of these is important in and of itself. At the same time, and I started my studies in small group, task-oriented group, where the question of is a leader important was an important question. My first publication was an experimental study in which, in just a very simple way, I'm not going to go into the details because it wasn't that great of a study, but simple observation. Yes, a leader's presence is important as to the group does some things better if a formal leader is present. Now, some people showed that if a formal leader was acting in the group, that sometimes wasn't so good. I think overall, what we found over the last 50 or 60 years of research is the right leadership acts in a group can make an enormous difference in the quality of the decision. I do a lot of this at the University of Washington. I mean, right now I'm chairing a council on faculty benefits and retirement. And groups like that cry out for somebody who knows how to guide the group, help bring out the resources, the talents of the group. And so much of that is communication. We observe that in our daily lives, at home, at work, school, at play, at worship, wherever. We observe the effects of bad leadership or inadequate leadership, and we observe the effects of good leadership. So, and to me, much of that has to do with communication. It has to do with character and hard work and those things, of course. But sometimes you can have a very devoted person working so hard, such a pure heart. And I suppose if you wanted to have a pure heart or rhetorical skill, you'd probably take a pure heart. But boy, sometimes you need somebody with some rhetorical skill to make things happen in the world, good things happen in the world. So of course I think there's a case for putting those two things together. The other thing about it is that it seems to me those are two words that encompass so much that many people can could find an intellectual home and say, well, you know, I'm interested in helping people, helping food banks get better food on their shelves and getting it to the right people and having enough money to stay open. And so I want to learn how to communicate with people and how to lead people so that this gets done. Somebody else might say, what I think I could lead a startup in a way that would be so great, and I've got a little startup and I'm working on it, but you know, these people I work with are crazy. That's
a hard part of it.
Yeah, and I'm not so sure about myself either. You know, okay, maybe they could learn something in program communication. So I mean, that would be my initial take on that.
No, I appreciate
people with,
that.
You know, with important goals that they bring, and they see an opportunity to realize those that they might not get in some different type of program.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, because that's really partly what we've been trying to do with, we talk about communication and social change, connection of leadership. The reason for getting education is to give away what you know. Somehow, and it comes from the Jesuit ethos too, about doing something in the community, so there's an action step, and so those are the kinds of things when we're talking about leadership, we're talking about it in the general sense, but really how can you influence, if you're not the leader, you're a follower, whatever that role is, how can you make that thing go better than it's going? And so perhaps look at the big issues, what you can do with those things. So we appreciate your comments. And thank you very much for being our visiting scholar.
My pleasure. Thank you.